We're here on Daf Daled Amud Aleph, and the last thing that we discussed yesterday was the issue of receiving contributions from Goyim. And we presented a machlokas on this issue between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Now, in order to appreciate this machlokas, we have to go back to the Mishnah itself. And the Mishnah is on Daf Gimel Amud Beis. So by way of introduction to this machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish that we want to address today, we refer first back to the Mishnah itself, which is on Daf Gimel Amud Beis. And the Mishnah, if you count up on Daf Gimel Amud Beis, approximately 5 lines up, the Mishnah says that Hanochri v'akusi sheshaklu ein mekabla mehem. We do not accept machzis hashekel neither from a nochri, and that's based on a pasuk in Vayikra Chav Beis, umiad ben nechar lo sakrivu, etc., etc., and not from a kusi. Now, the simple pshat of kusi here, in explaining why we cannot accept their machzas shekel, would be that a kusi has the same status as a nochri, and that's how Rabbi Ba in the Yerushalmi on Daf Daled Amud Aleph explains this Mishnah based on the sheet of Rebbe, that the status of a kusi is identical with that of a nochri, and their conversion from the get-go was not a valid conversion. If, on the other hand, we want to reconcile this Mishnah with the Bar Plugta, the dissenting view of Rebbe, and that's the view of other Chachamim, they say that, in effect, the Kusim, at least initially, underwent a valid gerus, which means gerei tzedek came. Then the question becomes, why do we exclude them from machzis hashekel? And the Gemara is going to quote a pasuk that excludes kusim, which means that they are not excluded under the general halacha of miyad ben nechar lo sakrivu, etc., because they are not categorized as ben nechar, but under a separate exclusion. There's a separate din of ein mekablim shkolim mikusim. And that's going to be the opinion of the Amora Rab Lazar, otherwise called in the Yerushalmi Rab Lezer, or Lazar. Then the Mishnah goes on to speak about karbanos. Can we accept karbanos from kusim, from nochrim, for example, kinei zavim, kinei zavos, kinei yoldos, chatos v'ashamos? And the Mishnah formulates a klal. And the rule is as follows. If we're talking about karbanos chova, karbanos which are brought, let's say, at the end of ziva, or, for example, someone who violated the Torah, and he brings a chatos or a nasham, those are karbanos chova. Those karbanos have no application, no relevance to nochrin. Without getting into the question of kusim, let's assume, like Rabbi Ba, that in our Mishnah, kusim are considered like nochrin. We do not accept a karban chova from a nochri. And that would apply, for example, in the case of a guy who violated one of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, like, for example, Avodah Zarah, and had he been a Jew, he'd be chayav a chatos. Or, in the case of a karban asham, if you steal something and then you deny it with a shvuah, and then you finally confess your crime, you have to bring a karban asham. In the case of a guy, we do not accept his carbon chatas, carbon osham, or kinei zavim, etc., because those are classified as karbanos chova. However, if the guy wants to bring a nidava, so the klal is mekablin biyada. We can accept a carbon nidava from a non-Jew. Now, what is a carbon nidava with regard to a non-Jew? So that we accept. This is a sugya in Masechet Menachos on Daf Ayin Gimel and Beis, and the Gemara records a machlokus between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yossi Aglili maintains that any carbon nidava whatsoever can be accepted from a guy, and that would include olos, shlomim, menachos, levona, eitzim. All the above, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, can become nidavos, which are accepted from a guy. Rabbi Akiva disagrees with Rabbi Yossi Aglili, and he holds that the only carbon that we accept from a guy as a nidava is carbon ola. This Mishnah that we're learning here in Shekalim would seem, at the face of it, to reflect the shita of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, and therefore we would paskin like Rabbi Yossi Aglili against Rabbi Akiva. And the Mishnah here, reflecting Rabbi Yossi Aglili, formulates a klal, a general, all-inclusive klal, that kol shenidav v'nidar v'nidav mekablim miyadav. Anything, whatever the category is, ola, shlomim, menachos, etc., if it's a carbon nidava, then we accept it from a guy. So we paskin therefore like Rabbi Yossi Aglili in this case. We have a stam Mishnah like Rabbi Yossi Aglili against Rabbi Akiva. And the Mishnah goes on to quote a pasuk in Ezra. It's actually in the 4th parak of Ezra, to prove that we don't accept a carbon chova from a nachri. Now, let's assume, once again, like Rabbi Ba, that our Mishnah reflects the shita of Rebbe, and a kutzi is a guy. The pasuk that we're going to quote now in this Mishnah from Ezra is specifically and explicitly referring to a kutzi. And the pasuk says, I'll read to you the whole pasuk, Vayomer lahem Zerubbabel, v'Yeshua u'sha'ar rashei avos liYisrael, lo lachem v'lanu livnos beis Elokeinu. Now, to appreciate that pasuk in Ezra, we have to read another pasuk in Sefer Nehemiah. Sefer Nehemiah records that when the Kusim found out that we were building the Beis HaMikdash, they came forward and they wanted to offer their contribution on behalf of the Mikdash, what we call Bedek HaBayis. The pasuk in Ezra is establishing that lo lachem, again, we have to understand the word lanu, we'll have to figure that out as a separate topic, but lo lachem livnos beis Elokeinu, which means that you have no chelek in the Beis Hashem, and we're not going to accept your contributions for the building or the upkeep of the Beis HaMikdash. Our Mishnah makes the following analogy or the following equation. There's an equation here between A, which is Bedek HaBayis, a contribution, a monetary contribution, and B, Karbanos Tzibur. You don't have a chelik in Karban Tzibur. Now, on the Mishnayos, we have a super commentary all over Mishnayos, all of Shas, called the Tiferes Yisrael. The Tiferes Yisrael says that our Mishnah is operating with a Kal Vachomer. if we don't accept the contributions of the kusim, assuming the kusim now, just to make life simple for ourselves, are goyim for a carbon tzibur, then how much more so do we exclude the nachrim, the kusim, from contribution for a carbon yachid? Meaning that according to the way the Tiferes Yisrael understands that Mishnah, there's kal and it's chamur. Tzibur is kal and yachid is chamur. Meaning, if I understand correctly, Tiferes Yisrael, there's more of a logic that compels us to accept a gift or a contribution from a nachri in the case of a carbon tzibur, because he gives his money over to the tzibur. He's not claiming it's my gift and I have private ownership. And yet, the Torah, through Parshas Ezra, is excluding the nachri from a carbon tzibur, and Bedek Habayis equals carbon tzibur in this context. How much more so a carbon yachid, where the guy is going to claim this is my personal ownership and the contribution is mine, how much more so we're going to exclude it. So that's what we have in the Mishnah. And we started the Gemara yesterday on Daf Daled Amud Aleph of Nachri and Kusi. And before we begin that review of what we did yesterday about Nachri and Kusi at the end of yesterday's discussion, I first want to introduce a machlokas here with regard to Nidarim and Nidavos. We said that although the guy is excluded from a carbon chova, he will be accepted when he offers a carbon Nidava, whether it's limited to Olos, according to Rabbi Kiva, or Rabbi Yosef Glili, any carbon Nidava whatsoever. So let's begin with the Shita, the Rivavan, or the Rush, and it's all quoted by the Taklid Chadatin. He says that Makabla Mehem Nidarim Unidavos. Why do we accept the contribution of a guy with Nidarim Unidavos? After all, we excluded Nidarim. We excluded the Goyim from Karban Chova based on the pasuk Miyad ben Nechar lo sakrivu, and ostensibly that should include even a carbon Nidava. Why does the Mishnah say the klal that we can't accept a carbon Nidava from a guy? So the Mefarshim write, and these already Rishonim, Mishum shedarshu me'apasuk each ish lerabos minochrim shemeviim nidarim unidavos ki Yisrael. And apparently this is based on a sifra, and that sifra derives from an extra pasuk each in the parsha of Nidarim and Nidavos, that the extra ish is coming to include Nachrim. Fine. So that's what we have so far. We can accept Nidarim and Nidavos from a guy, and the first and the Rivavan and the Rush derive this from an extra pasuk ish. Now comes the Mishnah Lamelech, Perek Yud Milchas Malach. Nachri Nadar Lahavi Karba Lebeis Hamikdash Yesh Lad. The guy took upon himself a pledge to bring a voluntary carbon to the Beis Hamikdash. Our Mishnah says we accept that carbon. Mishnah Melch vacillates on the following point. Once he took the neder, is he chayav to bring the carbon? Again, we're talking about goyim who want to bring a carbon to the base of Mikdash on a voluntary basis. We accept that carbon. And now the Mishnah Mech wants to know, can we pin him down, so to speak? Or does the Jewish law obligate him? And he's made a commitment. He's expressed and enunciated a vow. So in the case of Yisrael, if I take upon myself to bring a carbon and dava, then the Torah says, Bal Yachel Dvaro, Motzav Asasecha Tishmar, and my verbal pronunciation generates an obligation to bring a carbon and dava. Again, it's a carbon and dava. I'm not obligated to the carbon, but I'm obligated to bring the carbon by virtue of Bal Yachel Dvaro, the Parsha Nedarim. What about a guy? The first side of the Mishnah Melch Safik, he says that a guy is obligated to bring this carbon once he took the neder. O Dilma, Rak Mekabel Mimenu in Mevi, but he's not obligated to bring the carbon despite the fact that he took a pledge. Sharei Apsukim lo Yachel Dvaro Umotsis Vasechet Tishmer Nemru li Yisrael v'lo ben Noach. So the drush of Ish that includes a guy in Nidarim Nidavos is a pasuk that reflects on our Kabbalah, our acceptance of his carbon, and not on his obligation to bring the carbon. In the second side of the Mishnah, he has no such obligation. This, despite the fact that he took a pledge. Because he's not included in Bal Yachel Dvaro. And the amazing first side in the Mishnah Melech is that with regard to Nidarim Nidavos, a guy like a Jew is committed under the law of Bal Yachel Dvaro. It's a pella because it's not one of the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. I mean, if you're telling me we accept the carbon, and that's derived from the extra ribui ish, das can ifashteim. But to tell me that he's obligated to bring the carbon like a Jew because of Bal Yachel, are we now adding to the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach the Parsha Nedarim? And the Mishnah Melech is no fool. He quotes a Yerushalmi in Masechet Nazir. And in Masechet Nazir, the Gemara brings a machlokes. Again, we're talking Yerushalmi and Nazir. Yesh beben Noach Isur Bal Yachel, ein beben Noach Isur Bal Yachel. Now, it's if the Mishnah Melech himself came up with this chiddush that a Nachri is included in the Isur Bal Yachel and his neder is binding, we tell him to fly a kite. But he quotes the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi has one opinion that a Ben Noach is included in Bal Yachel Dvaro. Now, it's a pella. And the maskana of the Gemara is that the machlokes about Ben Noach is not only with regard to Nidarim, but also with regard to Shvuos. We know there's a difference between a Shvua and a Neder. And we know that Yisrael is included in both Neder and Shvua. The guy, according to one opinion, is included in both Neder and Shvua. Now, the Ktsos HaChoshen, in his famous work called the Avnei Miluim, is unaware of this Yerushalmi, apparently. And he writes, "Bevadai ein b'men Noach mishum Bal Yachel, umotzis v'sechet Tishma." What are you talking about? We have 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach, and Bal Yachel Dvar is not one of them. Elakevon sha'amru sheyitnu. If a guy says that he is giving and bringing, offering a carbon and dava, ami Russell l'gavah kamisi Russell ahejo, that once he makes that declaration, that is a kinyan, and the gizbar now can collect the carbon based on ami Russell l'gavah. The govim in chasav. Let's say, for example, there's one man who says Shibud Doraisa at the end of Bava Basra. He was Meshabed his Nechasim by virtue of his Amira. Normally, you need a Maisa Kinyan, but with a Gavoa, for Hegdesh, you don't need a Maisa Kinyan. So, Rabosai, just to summarize, we have a fundamental machlokas here about the nature of the collection of Nidarim Nidavos from Goyim. That we have one side to say it's just halachin collection, that we're allowed to collect it, but then we have to ask what gives us the right to collect it. And here we have a machlokes between the Mishnah Melech and the Avnei Miluim. The Mishnah Melech understands, based on one opinion in Yerushalmi and Nidarim, in Nazir, that the commitment of a guy as a verbal declaration comes under the Parsha Bal Yachal Dvara, which includes both Nidarim and Shvuos, according to that Man Yoma. And the Avnei Miluim just throws it out of court. There's no such thing. Again, what he does with the Yerushalmi, Mirza Shem, one day we'll study the Yerushalmi, the 9th parak in Nazir. We'll see what we can do with it. But the Avnei Miluim says that our ability to force the guy to come forward with his neder or nedav is not based on the parsha of Nedarim. That parsha was not given to Ben Noach, but rather on the halacha of amirasa l'gavah k'mesirasa lehed. Now he quotes the Mishkanos Haroim. Somehow I think I may have the Mishkanos Haroim is published at the end of the Yerushalmi, in the back of the Yerushalmi. Eich efshar, he asks, lahakriv korban shel nochri, harei yesh lachush, dilma chazer bo. Imagine, the guy brings the lamb for a korban olah, a nidava. According to both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili, we will be makriv the korban. How do we know it's hekdesh? Maybe after the guy brought the lamb, he was chozer bo. He changed his mind. And that's called tos. That means there's a halacha of haTorah. HaTorah applies to the Nedarim, and HaTorah applies to Hegdesh. The real technical word, the terminology is called she'ela. You could be shoel on Hegdesh. How do we know the Nachri wasn't shoel on Hegdesh? He changed his mind, and we're going to be bringing chulin lazara. Says the Mishkanos Haroim, yesh she'ela l'Yisrael v'yein she'ela l'Nachri. In other words, he's assuming, if I understand correctly, like the Avnei Miluim, that the entire episode of a Nachri bringing a korban Nedarim has nothing to do with the Parsha Bal Yachal Dvara. In the Parsha Bal Yachal Dvara, it says, "Hu eino machal Dvara, v'aval acherim machalim." In the Parsha Bal Yachal Dvara, the Torah is machadi she'ela. You could be shoel on an eder. In front of 3, in front of 1 Yachid Mumcha, whatever the dinim are. That parsha doesn't apply to a guy. Is Memela, he has no she'ela. And if he has no she'ela, then we know for sure that we're bringing Hegdesh and it's Kodesh into the Azor. Okay, that's what we have so far. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So here's where we're up to now. And we're on Daf Daled Amud Aleph. It's mamish smack in the middle of the Amud. I'm just trying to wonder if there's any shortcut. Okay, hopefully you heard the shir yesterday, so you'll know where I'm up to today. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, mamish halfway. The first word in the line we're going to study is B'tchila. So this Gemara that we're learning now is a grafted Gemara from Erchin Daf Vav that brings a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says the following, that B'tchila, when we're building the Beis HaMikdash, we don't accept any contributions from the Nachri whatsoever. But Basof, after the Mikdash is already built, If you're dealing with upkeep, which is called Bedek Habayis, then it depends. Is it a davar mesuyam or a davar she'eno mesuyam? If it's a davar mesuyam, which means that the guy is contributing an object, call it X, and from now on, everybody knows it's public, it's hekera, it's nikar, that object X was donated by the guy, we cannot accept it from the guy. But if it's a davar she'eno mesuyam, for example, he gives us some object of value and we're meant to sell it on the market and use the funds for the upkeep of the mikdash, then we can accept it from a guy. Reish Lakish says no, absolute. L'chumra, l'chumra, l'chumra. We will never accept a contribution from a guy for the mikdash. Not the tchila, not when we're building the Beis HaMikdash, and not the sof. And even if it's a davar she'eno mesuyam, we will not accept it from a guy. Now, Rabbi Yochanan b'tchila ein mekablim men lo davar mesuyam v'lo davar she'eno mesuyam. Even if it's not mesuyam, we're building the Beis HaMikdash, and he's contributing something that we'll sell, and we'll use the funds for the building of the Beis HaMikdash. That's called b'tchila, and it's a davar she'eno mesuyam. Yeah, he's offering a bag of salt, and we're going to sell the salt and use the money earmarked for the building of the mikdash. We're afraid that we have to depend on goyim. We don't want to depend on goyim. Maybe they have a vested interest in undermining us. They want us to rely on them for their monies, for their funds. And then at the end, they're not even going to come forward with the funds. And we're going to be ma'akev es habinyan. We won't be able to continue in the binyan. We want to be self-sufficient, and the Jewish community is going to support the building of the Beis HaMikdash. And that's it. We are not going to allow any contributions to be earmarked for the Mikdash. And that's called bitchila. Even though it's a davar she'eno mesuyam, it's something that will be converted to funds, to liquid assets by being sold on the market. However, Basov, we already have the Mikdash built. Hushlam HaBinyan. And now, the only issue is that the goyim are misparim. They boast. You see that crack in the mikdash? We fixed the crack in the mikdash. You see those objects on the gag, on the roof of the mikdash that keep away the arvim, to keep away the ravens. We contributed that. That's called a davar mesuyam. But makabla meyem davar she'eno mesuyam. Says Rabbi Yochanan, if they offer us money or something that could be converted into money, nobody could point and say, look, the guy can't boast about the fact that this was my money, because the Gizbar will decide what he does with these funds. Davar she'eno mesuyam is mutter when it's lebasov. If it's l'tchila, we're relying on the goyim. We have to be self-sufficient. When we're building the Beis HaMikdash, it's got to be 100% Jewish funds. But once the Mikdash is built, and now we need it for upkeep, and it's a davar she'eno mesuyam, the guy cannot claim that's what I get. So, for example, if I would say it that the halach is like Rabbi Yochanan, and if I would apply Rabbi Yochanan to a Beis HaKnesses, when the guy comes forward, his contribution could not be accepted to build the shul. Shul is up, and now we want to embellish it, and we need extra funds. We want upkeep. There are cracks in the walls. We have to do a new paint job. So now we ask the following question. Does the guy have his name on the object? Again, every shul is a little different. Like, I remember my brother-in-law's shul in Brooklyn, they had, the windows, they had a little chain, and there was a thing at the end of the chain. It was suspended, and that little thing had a name of somebody who contributed. So you want to put the name of John Paul Jones? That's not acceptable. That's a davar mesuyam. But if the monies that are being contributed by John Paul Jones are swept along, they're swallowed into a pot of money, and we are going to use that money for the upkeep of the synagogue in any way, Rabbi Yochanan would say it's mutter. Lakish Amar Bein B'Tchila Bein B'Sof Mekablim Lo Dover Mesuyam V'Lo Dover She'ena Mesuyam. And one would wonder why Reish Lakish went so far, disagreeing with Rabbi Yochanan, and he didn't even allow Basof in a Dover She'eno Mesuyam. What's the problem? We're not relying on the Goyim. We already have the Beis HaMikdash is built. The guy cannot claim lehispire and boast that this is my contribution because the Dover She'ena Mesuyam. Maybe, as we'll see, Reish Lakish has a Gzeras HaKasuv that excludes any monies from a guy that's coming in for the sake of the Mikdash. And the big question is going to be, what about Karbanos? We accepted, as formulated in the Klal in the Mishnah, Karbanos Nidava from a guy. Now, some of that money is going to be used exclusively for the animal that's going to be burnt on the Mizbeach or eaten, parts of it are eaten, the boss is eaten by the Kohen. But there's what's called Mosar. And there may be leftover funds, and especially for those Karbanos that are accompanied by Nesachim, and there's Mosar Nesachim, and that money is used for the upkeep of the Beis HaMikdash. The question is, how do we reconcile Nedarim and Nedavis, which is acceptable from a guy, with Reish Lakish's perspective that there's an all-inclusive, absolute Isur of taking money from a guy that could be used for the Beis HaMikdash? I'm just giving you a little bit of a taste of what we're going to get in about 5 minutes. Masnisin pligi al Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara claims that our Mishnah is against Rabbi Yochanan, who says that we can accept contributions from Goyim once the Mikdash is up, as long as it's a Dover She'ena Mesuyam. Now, I told you that the word Masnisa refers to our Mishnah. That's true more often than not in the Bavli, but in the Yerushalmi, the word Masnisa refers to a Brisa. And the Brisa says, Ein mekabla mehem hegdesh unidava lebedek habayis. Now, hegdesh and bedek habayis, these are terms that are used after the Mikdash is already built. I mean, that's clear in the case of bedek habayis, that bedek habayis means the upkeep of the Mikdash. But even the word hegdesh is used, generally speaking, you say you bring Hegdesh to the Mikdash after the Mikdash is built. You wouldn't use the term Hegdesh if you're referring to Mitchila while the Mikdash is being built. And the Brisa formulates an all-inclusive prohibition, prohibiting accepting from Goyim, the word Mehem means from the Goyim, Hegdesh u'nedavel lebedek habayis. Why didn't the Brisa qualify this? What kind of nedava are they bringing? Are they bringing monies, cash, liquid assets, or are they bringing specific objects, a davar mesuyam, that they can claim, oh, my name is on that object? The Brisa doesn't differentiate. So the stama of this Brisa, ein mekablim em hegdesh, etc., seems to imply even a davar she'eno mesuyam. And that's against Rabbi Yochanan. So the Yerushalmi answers, Pasarle. And I think the words Pasarle, again, I'm very unfamiliar with this term. I don't see it in the Yerushalmi, in the Bavli, but I think Pasarle is the way that the Yerushalmi indicates that he reinterpreted the Brisa. Pasarle. Bein betchila, bein besof, ubilvad. Again, it says ubilvad dover mesuyam. I think it means bilvad shehu dover mesuyam. Meaning that Rabbi Yochanan is going to interpret this brisa as referring to both tchila and sof. Now, in the case of tchila, Rabbi Yochanan agrees that it's an absolute Iser Kabbalah, even in the case of a Davar Sheina Misuya. So the reason why this brisa omits the qualification is because this brisa is referring to both tchila and sof. We thought when we attacked Rabbi Yochanan in the Makjan that since it used the words hegnish and bedek habayis that we're talking about basov, and there was no qualification implying that even a davar she'eino misuyam is prohibited. And we're talking basov that's against Rabbi Yochanan who allows davar she'eino misuyam basov. The answer is no. This brisa, despite the fact that the brisa employs these terms hegnish and bedek habayis, is referring even to tchila. And since the brisa is referring even to tchila, there was no room for qualifying this isur to a davar misuya, because if you talk even tchila, then it is swallowed. Then included in that isur is in a davar sheina misuya. The taklin chadatin goes one step further. He says the brisa is talking dafka b'tchila. Now, how are you going to get away with that? So he has another girsa, the Yerushalmi, as I told you a million times. The Yerushalmi is like silly putty, kechomer b'yada yotze, whatever your girsa is, you rewrite the text. It's so radically different than the Bavli. And in the text of the Yerushalmi, in the Taklin Chadatu, it says, and he quotes it as a nusach yashan, like this is from an old manuscript. I don't know exactly how he got access to it. And it says that patale b'visuyam shafilu ma'osav yolicham liyam hamelach. The Hersta a whole new Yerushalmi. And he says that afilu ma'osav. Ma'osav means, if I understand correctly, the guy came forward with liquid money, with currency. And the Yerushalmi says, Yolicham liyam hamelach. We have to, again, do me a favor, don't publicize this amongst your non-Jewish neighbors. Okay, we're all here in Yerushalayim, so none of us have non-Jewish neighbors. But if anyone listens to the shir in Massachusetts, don't. This is something that we want to keep a little bit private. So if you're if you have an art school Gemara, hopefully they didn't know about this girsa of the Yerushalmi of the Taklin Chadatin. Because again, I wouldn't want to get in trouble with my non-Jewish neighbors, but we're saying that the non-Jewish neighbor brought funds, and he wants these funds to be dedicated to the Beis HaMikdash, and we're going to take these funds and we're going to throw them into the sea. Molicham liyadam hamelach. And what that means is this phrase Molicham liyadam hamelach appears throughout Shas when you want to cut off any hana, any benefit that you get from Isuri hana. So let's say you have orla or chametz, throw it into the Yam HaMelech. We don't want to get any benefit from the monies of the goyim. Throw it into the Yam HaMelech. I would notify them about that. Ubi ofen kazeh ein chiluk. There's no difference between davar mesuyim and davar she'ena mesuyim. Yolichu es hanidavar liyam hamelech v'ya'abdu oso sham. We got to destroy it in the Yam HaMelech. And Rabbi Yochanan is interpreting that we're talking about mitchila, and mitchila, even though it's a davar she'ena mesuyim, its currency yolicham liyam hamelech. But if, on the other hand, it would be basof, then currency would be accepted. because that's a davar she'eino mesuya. Again, there's no way that we could put this shot into our text in the Yerushalmi. Our text in the Yerushalmi says explicitly, "Bein b'tchila u'bein b'sof." Comes along Rabbi Yochanan, and he says that since it's talking "Bein b'tchila, bein b'sof," therefore it applies even to a davar she'eino mesuya. But in the case of Basof, it's only applicable. This Isur of the Kabbalah is only applicable to a davar mesuya. And that's not something that's being addressed by this price. And now the Gemara is going to attack Reish Lakish. He's not free. We don't let Reish Lakish off the hook. Rab Shimon Lakish, Amar bein b'tchilu bein b'sof, ein mekablim em lo davar mesuyam lo davar she'eino mesuyam. Masnisa polig al Rab Shimon ben Gamliel. And now we're learning a piece of Gemara from Masechet Eruvin on Daf Heyam and Beis. And what I'd like to do is take a few minutes to give an introduction to this Gemara in Eruvin, because our text does not quote the whole story of the Gemara in Eruvin. It just starts with the Tani Hakol Shavin. Hakol Shavin means they both agree. What was the original machlokes about which they both agree in a certain case? So the Mishnah in Eruvin records a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. And this is a case of Eruvin, Arachim. Now here we have to know that there are two categories of pledges, of monetary pledges. One is called Erchin, and the other is called Damim. So Damim is a simple case where a person says, I accept upon myself a chiyuv Damim. I will pay a certain value of currency of money. But we're not discussing in this machlokes a case of Damim. That wasn't his pledge. His pledge was Erchin. And who took this pledge? About which this machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda? It was a guy. We'll see in a minute that there's another scenario which is also part of this machlokes where the Israel took the vow, the pledge of Erchin. So let me first quote to you the language of Rabbi Meir and the formulation of the dissenting view of Rabbi Yehuda. And the machlokus is min hakotz el hakotz, from one extreme to the other. According to Rabbi Meir, with regard to an akum, nerach velo marich. Okay, let's understand what nerach velo marich means. I'm going to start backwards, if it's okay, with the word marich. Lo marich. His marich is invalid, according to Rabbi Meir. What does marich mean? The guy said, I accept upon myself erchin, which could mean either erki alai or erech shel ploni alai, erko alai. Acherim, he says the erech of acherim is alai. Alai means I've taken the vow, the pledge. Says Rabbi Meir, that's invalid, which basically means that a guy is excluded from erchin. When he says erki alai, or he says erech ploni alai, it's not valid. However, akum nerach. Nerach means we can evaluate his value on the market, on the slave market, for purposes of erch, which means that the Yisrael said erko alai. He pointed to the guy, instead of saying erki alai or erko shel Yisrael alai, he said erko shel goy alai. Rabbi Meir says that that is a valid erch, because although the guy is excluded from erchin, that means he cannot be marif, but he's a nerach. And if a person says erko, which means he accepts upon himself the pledge of erko, it could be the erko of a guy. Rabbi Yehuda says just the opposite. Rabbi Yehuda says marich the eno nerach. Marich means that if he said erko alai, now again it gets complicated because the Gemara says erko alai means he points to Yisrael, because again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, marich velo nerach. So if he says erki alai, if John Paul Jones says erki alai, that's not valid because a guy is not a nerach. So what does Rabbi Yehuda mean when he says marich? He is included in erchin. He says erech shel Yisrael alai, because the Yisrael is a nerach and a guy is a marich. When do we have the combination of marich and nerach, and both are valid? When the guy says erko shel Yisrael alai. Bishavin, hakol shavin, shehein nodrim vinidarim. Okay, now, as we said at the outset, there's something called erchin, and then it's called damin. Now we're talking about damin. Everybody agrees, there's no machlokes, there's no issue, that if the guy says damim, which would mean dami alai, or dmei Yisrael alai, and he points to Yisrael, we can accept his contribution. So again, when it comes to erchin, Rabbi Meir says that a guy is not a marich. He's a nerach, but not a marich. Rabbi Yehuda says he can't be a marich. He can only be a nerach. But now we're talking about nidarim. With regard to nidarim, did I say that right? Let me just go over that one more time. I always have to play it back to make sure that, according to Rabbi Meir, a guy is a nerach, but not a marich. I think we got it right. According to Rabbi Yehuda, a guy is a marich, but he's not a nerach. So marich means he says erko shel Yisrael. Fine. That's the ratio of the Mishnah Ercha, which was omitted in our text because our text is interested in slugging up Reish Lakish from the Sefer. Kulam shavim, hakol shavim, shein nodrim u vinidarim. So now we're no longer in the Pasha of Ercha, we're in the Pasha of Neder and Nedava, where the guy says dami alai or dmei Yisrael alai, mekablim imenu. Now, domim is for bedek habayis, and it says mekablim imenu. And we're talking about a davar sheina mesuya. That's fine according to Rabbi Yochanan. But according to Reish Lakish, who says there's an absolute all-inclusive Isra of being makabel, a contribution for the Mikdash from a guy, even if it's basov, for bedek habayis, and even if it's a davar sheina mesuyim like cash, we don't accept it. How is Reish Lakish going to reconcile his position with this Mishnah? Pasar le, so Shimon Lakish says that when the Mishnah says no dream, that's Ola. It doesn't mean no dream that he took Dami Olai or Dami Tmei Yisrael as Olai, but rather he said Ola Olai. And he has to bring a carbon Ola. Again, whether he has to bring the carbon Ola or not, we said it was a machlokes between the Mishnah Melech and the Avnei Miluim. But in any event, if he brings an Ola, we accept it. Why do we accept it? Because it's a carbon Nidava, and there's a drasha, a ribui of ish for a Nidava of a guy. So we're talking about karbanos. We're not talking about damim. For the guy to bring damim to the gizbar, we don't accept it. or the way the Traklin has it, we throw it into the Yam HaMelech. Even though it's a Dover Sheni B'Suyim, and even though it's Basop, that's Reish Lakish. The Mishnah Erchin says, Hakol Shavim, B'Nidarim, B'Nidav Shemekablim Mimenu. It means we're talking about a Korban Olah. So Gemara says, Nicha Nodrin. The word Nodrin can be explained as a neder to bring a Korban Olah. But it says Nidarim. How you interpret the word Nidarim as referring to a Korban Olah? Nidarim means that the Yisrael turned to a guy, pointed to a guy, and he says, his damim are a lie. So what is that? What does that have to do with the Korban Olah? I mean, the whole thing is bonkers here. Again, if it's Nodrim, so a guy could take a neder that I pledge to bring a Korban Olah, and we'll accept it from him. But how does the word Nidarim, how do you interpret that word Nidarim, where the guy is sort of the object, he's not the subject, and referring to a Korban Olah? Ella says the Gemara, what's Nidarim? Kisha Omar Yisrael Harei Alai Olah, V'shama Nochri V'Omar Mash Omar Zeh Alai. Ditto. Like the Gemara has in Masechet Nidarim, that somebody says Ehei Nazir, and someone else hears it and he says Gamani. Here also, a guy overheard a Yisrael who took upon himself a neder of Harei Alai Olah, and he immediately responded and he says, Masha Omar Zeh Olai, I'm also included in this neder of bringing a Korban Olah. Now the Gemara asks a kash on everybody, both on Reish Lakish and on Rabbi Yochanan. V'eno mevi imo nisachim, when a guy brings a Korban Nedava, which we accept, the Nedava is accompanied by Nisachim. So what? We have halach of Moser Nisachim, lo l'klei migdash. You know, this is a rhetorical question. What do we do with Moser Nisachim? Which means that from the Nedava of Nisachim sometimes is left over wine of Nisachim or soles. So what do we do with it? That money is earmarked for the Beis HaMikdash, and we buy a klei shares with it. Is nimtza mevi davar misuya? Even Reish Lakish, even Rabbi Yochanan, who is Mekil Basof, it was only in a case of a davar she'eino misuya. But kuliyam lo pligi, even Rabbi Yochanan agrees that in a davar misuya, we're not allowed to accept it, even if it's Basof. So he contributed Nisachim, that's a davar misuya. Okay. So the Gemara says a good question deserves another good question. Sometimes you answer a question with a question. Hey Siv, right? In Aramaic, the tuf replaces the shin. So Hey Shiv, Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Bon. And he responded with another question. V'taninan, the Mishnah Masechta Erchin says that goyim on Nerachim. Now Nerachim, if you recall, is the Shita Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir says that a guy is excluded from Erchin. So a guy is not a marich, he's a nerach. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it would be marichim, because he can be marich something. If the guy says Erech Yisrael Ploni Olai, again he has to say Yisrael, because otherwise on Olai he's not a nerach, so he has to pay. Now let's ask the following question: the Orchin Lola Bedek Abayis Inun. What do we do with the damim of Erchin? So again, what do you mean the damim of Erchin? It would either be according to Rabbi Meir in a case where he is a nerach, or according to Rabbi Yehuda in a case where he's a marich. But in any event, we're collecting, accepting these monies. And what are these monies going to be earmarked for? For Bedek Habayis. Now, the Gemara thinks, which again, I find this to be a pella, but the Gemara assumes that Erchin is called a Dover Misuya. I don't know exactly why. Anyway, the monies that are brought in for Erchin are used specifically to buy a Dover Mesuyam, and if the Erchin is considered a Dover Mesuyam. Believe neither, I'm going to try to work on that piece of the puzzle. I'm not clear as to why that's so. Anyway, so the Gemara says, now we're in trouble, even according to Rabbi Yochanan, because even though Rabbi Yochanan allows accepting a davar she'eino mesuyam, he agrees that you cannot accept a davar mesuyam, and we're assuming that erchin is a davar mesuyam. How can we accept erchin? Hechma diat omar taman. What answer can you give on this question? And once you give me an answer on this question, I'll be able to answer your question about Mosar Nisachim in the case of a carbon adov. Heich ma diat omar taman. What are you going to have to answer? That even though we're going to take the Dmei Erchin and we're going to purchase a Dover Mesuyam for the Bedek Habayis, that's not considered as if the guy contributed a Dover Mesuyam. Why? Because the guy is L'Shem Shamayim Hu Miskavin. He wants to bring Erchin as an Nedava, and hopefully his Nedava will culminate in some sort of Hakrava, a voluntary carbon on the Mizbeach. He doesn't know what we're going to do with this Nedava. Now, Leim Hein Boim Lebedek Habayis. Now, Leim means that it's the Gizbar's decision that these monies are going to be used for the Bedek Habayis. As far as he's concerned, any monies he's bringing in are being dedicated and donated for the purpose of the carbon. If there is somehow leftover Mosar money, that's the Gizbar's discretion, that he can earmark that money for the Beis HaMikdash, for Bedek Habayis, and make it into a Dover Mesuyam. But that's not what the guy was not interested in a Dover Mesuyam. He gave the monies for a carbon. And the same thing is in Dmei Erchin. He wasn't dedicating the money for Bedek Habayis. He wanted it, and he assumed that the Dmei Erchin would be used for a carbon on the Mizbeach. Is Kenat Omar Ha'at Hocha Afocha B'Shem Shamayim U'Miskaven. Then in the case of Mosar Nisachim, like the case of Dmei Erchin, it's the Gizbar's decision to earmark the extra monies of the Nisachim for the sake of Bedek Habayis. That wasn't the intention of the guy. The guy wanted to bring a carbon. He wanted to bring a voluntary carbon, and we accept a voluntary carbon. We derive that from each. Now some of those funds are being, we shave them off on top and dedicate them for Bedek Habayis. That's not the guy's intention. So the Gemara now is adding another element into the equation when you talk about our inhibition to accept gifts, monetary gifts for Bedek Habayis from the guy. because those monetary gifts can be converted to a davar mesuyam, that's only when there was no element of carbon involved. But as far as carbon and davim and davis is concerned, we accept the davar and davis from a guy, and therefore the fact that there was extra funds or there were monies that were earmarked not for the mizbeach but rather for medikabayis, that is not included in the isur of accepting funds. So that's the underlying. This is where you want to put a line under it. Aleim means that the Nochi had nothing to do with this decision. He may not even know about this decision. We end up using his money for a davar mesuyam, and we fix the windows of the base hamikdash. He doesn't even know about that. As far as he was concerned, his monies were being brought exclusively for the sake of a carbon to be brought on the mizbeach. I'm just going to read the next. We're over time, but I just want to read the next few lines so that we finish the sugya. Ma Ovid la Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. What is Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish going to do with this business that the guy doesn't know about? Pasar la. So he says that even though Reish Lakish has an absolute rule, we do not accept funds from a guy, there is a Gzeres HaKosav that allows us, under certain conditions, to accept funds from a guy. And that's the pasuk in Ezra that the Mishnah quoted. Lo lachem v'lanu livnos beis Elokeinu. We're not allowed to accept from the guy when the guy dafka wants lispire b'nidava, so he wants to make, be proud of himself, boast about his nedava. And that's what Ezra said to them, Lo lachem, you think that you're building the Beis HaMikdash? We don't allow you to build the Beis HaMikdash. We will reject your contributions. Why? Because your intention is to build the Beis HaMikdash. But if a Dachri doesn't know what his funds are going to be used for, and we made the decision, the Gizbar, to reallocate his funds for Bedek HaBayis, then even Reish Lakish will agree that we can accept that contribution of a guy. So in Mr. Shem tomorrow, we'll pick it up with Rabbi Chizkiah Omar Rabbi Simon. I wish everyone a great day. I'm working hard.